James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Something may be legal, but that does not mean that it is not dodgy, and that does not mean that it is not unprincipled. In other words, being found not guilty is not the same as being innocent. It's a bit like investing in cluster munitions through a distant legal mechanism that is legal, but it doesn't make it right. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the Minister of Foreign Affairs has chosen to front in the House today to this report. It has been a long time coming. David Parker and I wrote to the Office of the Auditor-General, to the Auditor-General on the 28th of May last year, so it's been 18 months in coming, this report. And it finds that no laws were broken. But it also finds that there is a litany of incompetence, of unprincipled and rogue behaviour, of a cavalier approach to the use of public funds, and a complete lack of transparency. And, Mr. Speaker, as David Parker said in his opening remarks in this debate, surely we have higher standards for our ministers than merely not being crooks. Surely we hold them to standards of competence, that they observe due process and that they are transparent, that they use public funds wisely. It is quite an extraordinary picture that has emerged through this report, Mr. Speaker. I want to pick up on a few specific points within the report. First of all, the Auditor-General finds that the contract for services was used to transfer value to the Calaf Group in order to A, settle a grievance and a very vague claim for compensation. This is on page 8. And B, to resolve a diplomatic issue that was perceived to stand in the way of a trade deal, as outlined on page 9. There doesn't seem to have been a clear finding as to why compensation was dressed up as services. The Auditor-General refers to this as, quote, a convenient mechanism on page 9, and Mr. McCulley thought that compensation would need to be scrutinised by, quote, a plethora of lawyers and bureaucrats, end quote, and so he wanted to avoid it. This is on page 32. Because of this, guys, there was no analysis of the risk of a legal claim. There wasn't a clear explanation to Cabinet of what was going on. The contract doesn't contain any settlement wording at all. The OAG refers to these as significant shortcomings. She says that they are surprising and this is a failure to be transparent. It's worse, I think, that a minister is using a sham device to avoid proper process and scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, there are some specific quotes that I'd like to pull out. The Auditor-General says, "I was surprised that it was decided to use a contract with a private individual's business interests to resolve a diplomatic issue between governments." I'm just going to restate that. That is quite an extraordinary statement. It was decided to use a contract with a private individual's business interests to resolve a diplomatic issue between governments. She goes on to say, it's difficult to reconcile the words of the contract with the unstated objectives, which include resolving a complex diplomatic issue and removing a perceived obstacle to the signing of the free trade agreement. The contract for services was a convenient mechanism by which the allocated $10 million, which later became $11.5 million, was put towards achieving those unstated objectives. She says, quote, "It does not tell the full story." Mr. Speaker, that is an extraordinary statement about the behaviour of any Minister of the Crown operating on behalf of the Government of New Zealand in our relations with private and governments overseas, and it is absolutely intolerable on behalf of the New Zealand Government. $4 million was paid to a Saudi businessman because he asked for it. The Cabinet paper signalled that the risk of the claim was based only on the $20 to $30 million that the Cabinet paper said was suggested by the Al Khalaf Group itself. No one who was qualified to do so appeared to have considered whether the legal risk that Mr. Key and Mr. McCulley used in this House to justify the payment was at all legitimate. Nobody tested that. The payment was based on the unqualified assertions made by Mr. McCulley. The Auditor-General goes on to say that in the Cabinet paper, there is the promised $3 billion worth of trade in 5 years with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and that there is no evidence for this claim in the Cabinet paper. There is simply an assertion, and the Auditor-General hasn't been able to find any evidence to back that claim up anywhere else. No one has tested Mr. Al Khalaf or the Gulf Council's claims that this was the one thing that was standing in the way of the FTA. That to me is extraordinary. It's utterly extraordinary. This is based on absolute hearsay. The fact that the FTA is still not signed suggests that it wasn't the only block. It also says that Treasury was supposed to have oversight of the project, and there doesn't yet seem to be any evidence that it was. So, Mr. Speaker, at the very least, this is clear incompetence. $8.7 million of public money has been spent against a budget of $11.5 million. It says that it is not clear on what basis those amounts paid were arrived at. These numbers just seem to have been plucked out of the air in the Cabinet paper. And in terms of competence, who thought that shipping South Island ewes to the middle of the Saudi desert was a good idea? Is anybody surprised that 75% of the lambs that were born there subsequently died? Mr. Speaker, it also says that there is a total lack of transparency. She says that the contract does not tell the full story. She says that to date, even at the date of the publication of this report, ministers and officials have not resolved those concerns about lack of transparency. Mr. Speaker, while Mr. McCulley and the Prime Minister and others will stand up and say that this report somehow fully vindicates their behaviour on the basis that no laws were broken, the behaviour exhibited, led by Mr. McCulley, is clearly incompetent, unprincipled, rogue behaviour, not transparent, and I have to say, it is extraordinary to me that he continues on in his role as a government minister. I think, Mr. Speaker, that is intolerable, and he should stand down immediately. The Prime Minister says that this was a creative solution. Well, I have to say, I started my career in one of the world's largest accounting firms, and we referred to creative accounting as things to be avoided at all costs, because Mr. Speaker, that is not the basis of a society or a government on the rule of law. And we have higher standards for the behaviour of our government than that. Mr. McCulley needs to go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.